I'm recovering from COVID, as some of you know, and so it's been a bit of a challenge. But I am really glad to have you guys on the call today, and I'm really also glad to be able to talk through our conversation today, which is really about home learning. And again, this first quote or this first description here on the screen about Albert Einstein and saying that things have changed, the world has changed, the answers have changed, even though the questions may be the same. That is entirely true for education and what we're talking about today. And so, again, that's kind of the foundation. I want to go through the goals for today. One, I want to alert you to some of the new answers. Again, using that Einstein story as a foundation. The world has changed. All the things that we used to think were accurate no longer are. Many of the things are no longer accurate. I also want to inspire you to lean into this idea of home learning. I want to demystify some of it as well. And then finally, I just want to be a resource. And so that's why, none of the things I'm doing are cost prohibitive. In fact, everything so far has been free because I just want to be a resource. So let's get into the presentation a little bit. The overview today, so in education, there's a concept called teaching to the middle. And some of you may know this. In every single classroom, there are some kids or some students that are way ahead and they're ready to go as fast as possible. There are some kids that are behind and are kind of just learning the material, and then a bunch of folks in the middle. In your child's classroom, the teacher is usually making a decision to teach largely in the middle. So kids at either end of the spectrum tend to get overlooked. Unfortunately, that's what's going to happen today. Some of you are calling in because you want specific ideas around how to homeschool, how to, what specific curriculum. I'm going to touch on it, but I can't get into the details unless you and I have a one-on-one conversation because it depends on your circumstance. And then other folks are really kind of just putting their toes in the water about what is home learning? Do I really want to do some of this? Does it make sense? So I can talk one-on-one to y'all, but you have to reach out to me, and you can go on my website and pick a 45-minute one-on-one conversation. Many of you all have done this, but that's how we get into the real details of your specific situation, and so I can't answer those questions that are specific today. In the chat box, though, I really want everybody to begin chatting about answering one another's questions. If you hear a question come up and you have an idea about it, answer it via chat. There are so many resources on this call right now, so many parents who have learned pieces of the puzzle that this is an opportunity to actually get people together to actually learn together and to share information. So please blow up the chat box, pay attention to those. You can also save those chats for yourselves if you'd like. All right, with that introduction, let's jump into it. So many of you saw my last post. I'm going to be continuing to post ideally weekly unless I'm flat on my back. But that's the best way to start to get more information about how to navigate and how to understand some of the new questions that are coming up. And now I'm going to go into some of the questions that came to me via sign up. So when you all signed up to participate today, you'll have the opportunity to ask a couple questions. So I'm going to answer some of these questions, and then I will open it up to the group for other questions, and then we'll talk about kind of next moves after that. So the first question is one about socialization in home learning, and this is from Avni. And I don't know if Avni, you're on the phone, but if you'd like to fill in the gaps, feel free. Her question again is about socialization, and for me and for my family, when we talk about socialization, now in the COVID world, it's a completely different conversation because now we're weighing health risks and trying to make sure our kids are socialized, right? So really, this is fundamentally a math problem. That's why you see the die there. And again, 8% of the United States population has been affected or infected with COVID. That means the majority of folks have not. Generally, you're safe, but the risk is a matter of your own personal risk tolerance. Again, we rolled the dice, came up snake eyes. I got sick. All three of my kids were diagnosed positive. None of them showed any symptoms whatsoever, but I was sick as a dog. So really the questions you all want to ask yourself around socialization is one, your age, the parent, not the child, your health condition. If you have existing health conditions, then you should be your risk tolerance should go down. You should be more risk averse. And then finally, the number of interactions. And here's where school is going to be a real question mark in the fall, because the number of interactions your child has, that is actually going to increase the probability that something's going to come back home or infect, your neighbor or your grandparent or whomever is around. So this question of socialization is completely different now. It's really based on your own risk tolerance. Here's what we do. Here's our solution to this. We have a low or zero risk option, which are things like Zoom movie nights. I'm sure there's some copyright infringement concerns there. I'm going to wait for someone to argue and to yell at me about that. But right now, that's how we make sure our kids are still interacting with some of their friends. And it's actually worked really well. But the acceptable risk level for us is something called social pods or quarantine pods. Some of you may have heard this. Google quarantine pods. There's an excellent New York Times article that talks about what this looks like. And in general, it is you making agreements, you the parent making agreements with your children's parents about how you're going to handle COVID. Some parents don't want to wear masks. Fine. To me, that's a risk that's unacceptably high. But to the degree you can contact your child's friends and say, listen, how are you handling COVID? What are you doing to protect your family? And if there's alignment, now there's a possibility of you guys actually working together and actually socializing as a group, as a family. That is kind of how we tend to do it. And so if that's what you're interested in, then your next move would be to contact your child's friends, one or two of them, and begin to have a conversation about what are they doing to protect themselves, what are you doing to protect yourself, and if the idea of a social pod makes sense. All right, so I hope that helps. All right, question number 2 is, this is actually a fantastic question from Lenice, and I'm just going to read it here. She's torn on parenting philosophy. One part wants to be progressive, which is child-centered and child-driven. The other part leans toward being a tiger mom. I completely relate, all right? So again, this parent wants their child to be scholars, but also feels some guilt because she's not clear on how she really wants to approach this educational situation with her child. Very common dynamic, and this actually encourages me because you as a parent are wrestling with the right questions. Here is how I tend to talk through this and how other families have talked and coached me about it. First, you start with this question, this big question of why. A couple weeks ago, we talked through this, and I still haven't downloaded that into a podcast, but it is to me the best summary of how you as a parent come to a realization of what your purpose is of raising your child. And it's not college, by the way, y'all. Your purpose is something much larger than college. It is not that your child gets a job. It's something much larger. But you have to go through some work to define what that why is. But that's where we start. Then there are these other questions that I really would encourage all of you to really wrestle with. The first is, again, I mentioned your why. What is your purpose? But secondly, think about this. What has changed in the world since you were in school? I mean, if you really stop and think about that, that is a mind-blowing question, right? First off, for me, I lost all my hair. That's a real problem. But that's just one of many things that have changed since I've been in school. So the question is, if those things have changed, how are you changing your child's education as a result? And frankly, most schools, it looks, tastes, and feels exactly as it did 30 years ago, because the schools have not adjusted. And it's not a function of, I can get into the reasons why that is, but fundamentally, if things have changed in the world, but the school is largely the same, then there's a disconnect and there's a problem. The second question, or the third question here is, what is expected to change going forward? Now, this question, again, will cross your eyes if you think about it too hard, because frankly, nobody knows. But we do know some things. We know that change is going to be fast and furious. And we also know that a child's ability to identify the thing that they're passionate about and the thing they want to sink their teeth into and go deep on is going to distinguish them from all the rest. So I'm talking a lot here, but let me go ahead and go through these last couple questions. What do colleges really want? If you really talk to, as I have, admissions officers at high quality universities, they don't want cookie cutter kids anymore. They're looking for kids that are actually unique, different, have had a different set of experiences. What do employers really want? They want problem solvers. They don't want worker bees anymore. They want people who can come in and anticipate a problem and fix it without someone telling them it has to be done. That's a completely different mindset. And then lastly, I want you to really stew on this question. What happens if and when your child really discovers their why, really discovers why they have been put on this earth? I'll tell you what will happen. You won't have to worry about that child anymore because they're going to be off to the races. So the question is, how do we build that? How do we support a child so that they can find their why to the point where they can engage on their own? Okay, and here's the tension that this parent talks about. The tiger parent is on the left side of that screen here. The tiger parent decides everything for that child and makes the decisions for them. On the other side of that extreme, though, is the unschooled child, where the parent lets the child do whatever they want. You want to not wear clothes today? Fine, no problem. I believe that both extremes have problems, and this is a graphic that I showed some of y'all a couple weeks ago. This is my philosophy, and again, philosophy other parents have shared with me about how they think about the transition between the parent doing things for the child and the child doing things for themselves. On the left side of the screen is, so this is kind of the level of control that a parent has over a child. When the child is born, 100% control by the parent, right? When the child's 1 year old, the parent cannot, I argue, cannot let a child make all their decisions because the child will be running and playing in the street, getting hit by cars and eating candy all day, et cetera, right? But if your child is now middle school or higher and you feel like you are making the decisions for that child, I would argue that that's a problem too. And that's a problem because the child is capable of doing far more than you might be allowing or supporting. And so really when we're talking about this tension between doing and telling the child to do things and letting the child do for themselves, this is kind of the structure of it. I believe as the child ages up, we have to continue to push the child to do more for themselves. We have to have higher and higher expectations about what they do, not only in an academic context, but around the house in preparation for becoming an adult and a functioning adult. So that's a bit of how I kind of answer this question about the tension between being a tiger parent and being a kind of an unschooled parent. So I hope that helps for the caller that wrote that in. All right, I'm going to pause now because I can do this all day. But I want to pause because I've thrown a bunch at you right now, and I want to find out if there's any feedback or any kind of questions that have come up so far. And then if not, we'll go into Jill's question and again, another excellent question that was submitted. Any questions? Just unmute yourself and jump in if you do that. Okay, I'm also taking a look at the chats. Again, guys, do not hesitate to chat. And I'm seeing not a lot of activity there, but that's feel free to ask questions or pose ideas there. Right? Okay, next question. This is from Jill. We anticipate a lot of home learning, but we do not want to unenroll. Again, this question to me is like I'm going to get on my soapbox. I'm just going to let y'all know. But we do not want to unenroll in Houston ISD because my children are magnet and will lose their spots for future years. So I think we will have to abide by whatever the school demands. Ooh, it gives me a shiver when I hear that language. But I want to be as effective as possible within their framework and their minimum expectations, which of course is a mystery at this time. So this is the reality of education today. And this is why I do the work I do, because this is why I started the education game. Parents are forced to navigate a system that is unfair. It's got all sorts of inconsistencies. There's this artificial scarcity. The idea that my daughter went to one of the top tier public schools, and they have this artificial scarcity where they have huge wait lists, but they will not expand their the size of their school. I'm getting on my soapbox, but this is exactly what happens in a university setting as well. Schools get promoted by restricting access. And again, I'll get off my soapbox because I can talk about that all day long. So here's the issue. There's a power differential at play. The school has a wait list. The school, again, there's a handful of schools that are highly competitive. And once you get in, parents are loath to leave because they will lose out on their seats. Schools, of course, know this. That power differential is part of the problem. But one thing I want to make sure you remember is that you, not the school, are your child's head coach. Ideally, the school comes beside you and supports what your initiatives and your desires are. Unfortunately, that does not happen, particularly when there's this power differential at play. But you do not, and I want to put a fine point on this, you do not have to abide by the school's demands, especially now this COVID environment is in place. Here's what's happening. The balance of power is shifting. When the school says to you, the parent, I need you to do the work that I, the school, used to do. I need you to do that work now, parent. Now you, parent, have more power. You can actually say, hey, I know that you're asking me to do your work, and I know you're asking me to do your work without pay. So I'm going to now argue that some of this work I'm not going to do, or I'm going to do it differently. Does that make sense? The power differential here is actually shifting, and that gives the parent much more autonomy and authority to make demands. Now, of course, the reality is you don't want to push that too far, because in this circumstance, the parent is in an environment where if she loses that spot, she feels like she's going to miss out. But this past spring, and this is going to happen again in the fall, this past spring, when parents would call me and say, my child is being asked to do 7 hours of homework a day, and she's 6. I said, listen, you can call your child's teacher and say, listen, you make up an excuse, but it doesn't really matter. My job that won't allow me to spend that much time with your child. I've got other kids in the household, whatever. Now you talk about narrowing and doing less, but better. So instead of 7 hours of curriculum, what is the essential? Do that and do it well. That is the kind of shifting of negotiation and power that's possible right now. And again, COVID creates the space to navigate and to negotiate. The other part, does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So again, you as the parent have more authority to make demands in this COVID environment because the school is asking more and more of you. All right? Now, here's the other part of this idea of, I want to do more home learning, but I don't want to, quit school and homeschool full time. It's what I call a shadow school. It's the idea that in school, your child are learning these things, but out of school, you're going to develop a different curriculum, and you're going to actually run those common curricula side by side. Over the summer is the best time to start, because right now, the school is not pressing you to do anything, usually. So now is the opportunity for you to begin to build up your own capabilities of home learning, because at some point this upcoming fall, it's going to shift back to you anyway. There will be outbreaks of COVID. The school will shut down. Many schools right now, and I've talked to several friends in the education space, are planning to have your child in school 2 days a week, sometimes 3 days a week, sometimes 1 day a week. I mean, it's as varied as you can imagine. But ultimately, work is going to show up at your home, and you have to make decisions about what work you're going to do. And if it's more than you want, or if it's not the right type of work that you want, you have the authority now to make adjustments and to negotiate with your child's teacher. All right. Still, I feel like I'm preaching here, but I'm seeing some chats now. Let me go ahead and pause. Got one chat for everybody. At what age do you think that a child is capable of determining his or her why? Excellent question. Looks like there's no answer to that. So here's kind of how I would approach that. It's a process. It's a process of discovery over the course of years, sometimes decades, before the child can actually determine what their why actually might be. But part of it is that you as a parent my view is you're charged with watching your child to see where there are some special giftedness, some special levels of creativity, some special curiosities that seem unusual. And from an early age, beginning the process of exploring those areas. So, the example that I give often is, a daughter of mine who, she was around 6 or 7, and she started really showing a lot of interest in marine biology. I said, well, that's interesting. I don't know exactly how that came up. I mean, I think she watched the documentary or something like that. But then we started to filter more and more content related to marine biology. And she began to really enjoy, want to go deeper. We then began to say, all right, well, here's some books. If you really want to go deeper, here's some books you have to read to understand it. Then she got, she did a internship at the zoo when she was in middle school. And so this kind of built up. And now as a 16-year-old, she knows she's pretty confident that she wants to do something in marine biology. She's making connections with existing marine biologists. She's talking to them on email. She's now filtering out other things and focusing deeper and deeper on marine biology. Not sure how that's actually going to shape out, but that's a model of what I think could happen for others. But we have to have the space to actually begin the exploration. And the parent's role really is one to study the child and to figure out where that child's giftedness is, to begin to support it and develop it. And again, do not assume that the school is going to be able to do that. It can't. It just doesn't have the space. It's not designed for that. That's your job to figure that out and to help your child figure it out for themselves. So I hope that helps a little bit with the question. It's a tricky one. It's not something I can give you a really straightforward answer, but there is a process of discovery over the course of time that should lead to a place where the child now has some sense of areas where they have a deep passion and are willing to work without you telling them to do it. And that's kind of the key. Okay, let's keep going. Next question, staying on task or focus. And this was a question from Martha. When we see a child who is not focused or not staying on task, we tend to always default to a medical problem. But it's not always a medical problem. In fact, I would argue many times it is not a medical problem. We have to diagnose it. It might be, but we have to diagnose it. And so the diagnosis falls into these different categories. The first one is really around student engagement. Is the child engaged? Frankly, if a child is bored, are you surprised that they're not focused or staying on task, right? So we're going to go through each of these because these actually bring up a bunch of questions and a bunch of concepts within education that we need to wrestle with if we are going to move into this home learning space more. Not homeschooling, home learning. So let's go ahead and start with student engagement. There are 4 types of disengagement and 1 type of engagement. In the 4 types of disengagement, ritual compliance, this is the kid that, frankly, a lot of smart kids fall in this category. They will do it in order to get the A, but they don't care about what they're learning. In fact, they don't even remember what they were learning 3 months after the test, right? That's ritual compliance. Passive compliance is the kid who, this is actually where I was growing up. I did the minimum necessary to avoid punishment, right? If a B was what I had to get in order to avoid my parents yelling at me, that's what I would do. Just complete passive compliance. And then there are more of the negative ones, which are retreatism. Child now is withdrawing. It's hard for them to do any work, or they are dragging their feet, or just straight out rebellion, where they are just, I'm not going to do it. You can't make me do it, right? You get into this kind of wrestling match with your child. But authentic engagement, you know it when you see it. And it is when students are really clear about the value to them, and they are immersed in it, and they're willing to do that without anybody telling them what to do. That is ideal, and frankly, it is horribly rare in education, horribly rare. So what do we do about it? You have to ask the question, what is the child studying? And here's this question again that I think it was Jill's question earlier around the tension between being a tiger parent and letting the child decide for themselves. There's a balance there, but to the degree you can let your child figure out some of the things that they want to learn about, while you're also requiring them to do some things that are just part of being, a kid. You got to wash the dishes. You got to, do math problems, right? But to the degree that you can expose them or offer things that they can learn about that they're curious about, that then actually does build engagement. But again, it is rare to happen in a typical school setting because the curriculum is designed by bureaucrats at the State House, and teachers are forced to implement that curriculum regardless of what the child's interests are. All right, so that's the student engagement. So if the child is disengaged, then that could be the reason why they are not following through on their homework or et cetera. The next one is really a question about how challenging the material is. If there's a misalignment between the child's capabilities and the content, then that's another place of disengagement. So here's a quick graphic that I put together that shows kind of in everything we're learning, there's this ideal level of challenge, ideal level of difficulty, we'll say. Above that ideal, though, leads to frustration. If you're doing work that you can't do, you physically can't do it, or you're unable to do it intellectually, it leads to incredible frustration. On the other side of it, below your ideal challenge level, if you are bored, you are going to disengage. And so what we tend to see is kids who, that arrow represents a kid who's flatlining in their learning. They're not learning anything new. They're going to eventually get bored with the material. Those are the kids that tend to show up as passive and ritual compliance kids. Yes, I'm bored, but I can get an A, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. That is the kid. Again, like me. Yes, I'm bored. I can go ahead and get a B without thinking about it. I'm going to go ahead and do that. That is passive ritual compliance. And again, it's hard to watch when a kid is in that space to me. The other is the frustration level that gets too high. And here's where you see a kid who retreats and rebels. This is where most kids who are in my experience, and again, I'm no educator, but I've talked to enough educators who shared with me these dynamics. When a kid is frustrated, doesn't know how to do the work, they get angry. Just like you would get angry if every day you went to work and you were given assignments that you literally could not do. Most kids are so far behind academically that a 5th grade material, they really should be working on 2nd grade material. And that's part of the beauty of online learning, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The ideal would be something more like this, where the child is constantly moving between getting close to frustration, but then backing off, getting close to boredom, but then increasing the difficulty level. And that's really where authentic engagement lives. But again, most education environments can't pay that close attention to every child. They just don't have the resources. That's a place where parents can turn in and begin the home learning based on what they're seeing here. All right, I'm gonna skip this one, just in the interest of time. But generally speaking, this question of how much work should a child do, I would argue it's far less than what's typically being sent home in this home learning environment. We can talk more about that. Here is the next one, though, and this is the question that I want everyone to really noodle on for the next 30 years, and it's the question around. What is the value of the work that you're doing? And I'm going to share my screen and show you a quick video, 2-minute video. I can get this to look right here. Okay, this guy's name is David Perkins. He's the professor of research and learning or something like that at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And here we're going to listen to him real quickly. Can you hear that okay? Thumbs up if you can.
You know, I think one of the most important questions that we face these days in education is, well, one sentence. It's what's worth learning. What's worth learning for contemporary times? What's worth learning for the next 20 years, 30 years? And the trouble is, this very, very important question is really not asked nearly often enough. Discourse around education tends to be about method. How are we going to get youngsters to learn what we've decided they ought to learn? I think that we need to think in terms of educating for the unknown, for what might come up, for nimble ways of thinking about it, for large understandings that can help us code the unexpected as well as the expected. And to me, that means that 90% of what we typically teach is a waste of time. 90% of what we teach probably constitutes particular skills and particular nuggets of knowledge that those kids will never encounter again in a significant way in their lives. It just doesn't matter. Well, that is completely bizarre. We simply have to do better than that. But it's very interesting to ask what this might mean in the context of the disciplines, physics, history, so forth and so on. What is one to do with them and how are they relevant? One way to think about it is that we need to teach content looking for what you might call understandings of wide scope. Not the narrow, deep pieces of knowledge that make up a large part of any discipline, but the ways in which the discipline looks outside itself. There are many rich insights to be found in literature, in history, in science, in mathematics, geography, wherever you want, that can speak very broadly to the lives people live, but they're not the basis of how curriculum is typically organized. We need to rethink that, and it's very challenging because, in my experience, curriculum is one of the most resistant fronts of education.
Okay. I know that was kind of a lot, but I want to ask the question, and I want folks to answer this. I want to ask the question, do you believe that 90% of what your kids are learning is a waste, as Dr. Perkins argues? I'm waiting for someone to unmute and give me their thoughts about that. Seeing some chats. Oh, someone unmuted? Yes, go ahead.
So I would say in terms of useful applied knowledge, they don't necessarily use a lot of it, but I think that there's usefulness in learning things maybe that are beyond what you would normally choose for yourself, in the way that it exercises your brain, develops discipline, develops perseverance to plug through something that maybe you don't quote unquote like. So I don't think it's as high as 90%, and I don't necessarily aim for my kids just everything that they're learning in school has to apply directly to their future job. You know, like I think slogging through Latin conjugations is a lot about character development as much as it is about learning the roots of English.
Good. Yep, great. Someone else. Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate that, and I think a lot of folks would agree with that sentiment, that learning is not just about preparing exclusively for your future. I'd like to hear some other thoughts about that. What is the percentage of teaching that is a waste?
Hi, Matt.
Hi.
Thank you so much for hosting this.
Yeah.
My name's Jennifer, by the way.
Hi, Jennifer.
I think I would agree with Cindy that there are components of learning that are generally pretty helpful, but sometimes the mode and the way that it comes across as rote learning that, again, is either exclusively applied to a test or exclusively applied to a particular project and then never engaged again, sort of reduces the usefulness. For my older son, he's engaged a lot of critical material within history classes, which I think have broad implications to current political moment. And it would be wonderful to see that kind of follow through high school. But then it also becomes like the professor was saying, the curriculum is the most sort of steadfastly thing in education, that they have to learn this stuff and they can't engage more than that. So I do think there are gems in there that I really enjoyed seeing my kids learn, but it's not necessarily applied throughout.
Yep. Thank you. Great points. And again, I'm not trying to convince you that 90% is the right number. or 80 or 70. My question, though, is for you to ask yourselves this question and to come to clarity about what you expect and what makes sense for you and your philosophy of education. The things that that this professor talked about, a couple of things are this idea of educating for the unknown. And again, my general philosophy is my job as a parent is to ready my child for their adult life, not job, but for their adult life. That means character principally, because I don't care if my child is a great employee if he doesn't have character, right? I also know that the world is shifting in such dramatic ways that I want my child to be ready and skilled and at handling ambiguity. But I want to ask again this question, and I think Jennifer may have touched on it a little bit. The facts that our kids are being taught, what is the reason that those kids are learning those facts? What's the principal driver of why our kids are learning the material that they are learning? Principally facts. What's driving that?
Well, I would just say, it seems hard to say that it could be anything but the values of those folks that put together the curriculum.
So values, yes, but
and understanding.
I would actually make it simpler. When the professor talks about understandings of wide scope, how do you evaluate if a child has understanding of wide scope? It's extraordinarily difficult. How do you evaluate if a child has narrow learning of tight factual information? That's actually a multiple choice test. And so the question, my argument is, and many have argued this before me, of course, is that the way that we're evaluating kids is driving the actual educational process, not the other way around. The test, making the test simple enough to evaluate, forces teachers to teach content that's simple enough for the child to know and then be evaluated on a standardized test. So understandings of wide scope is incredibly difficult to evaluate and assess. But I would argue, and I would submit you all to really evaluate this for yourselves, that is what your child is going to need going into the into the 21st century, far more than their ability to score on a standardized test. But that's me getting on my soapbox again. But I do want to challenge you to evaluate this question. Think about how Dr. Perkins described these questions of how of what we tend to do is we decide what kids should learn, and then we ask the question, how do we get them to learn that? The opposite is, what could or should a child be learning, and how do we inspire them to pursue that? There's a difference there. All right, so I'm going to keep going here. Any other comments on that?
I've got a comment on it.
Please.
So we were talking a little bit about authentic engagement and what is important to learn. I've got a daughter who really likes writing, and so but hates math. But she really wanted to write a science fiction novel about lobsters. So somehow in that, we pulled in algebra for the growth rate of lobsters. We brought in science. We brought in marine biology. We brought in protection of animals. We brought in like societal roles of making laws. And so, I taught her how to do good web searches for all of these things. And then she was the one who was pulling them all together.
Interesting.
And so I think, teaching her how to access those skills and think through the problem that she wanted to write about ended up pulling a lot of things into one place.
Right. Wow. How old is your child?
She's 13.
13. Yeah. So what you're describing was Johanna. Is that right?
Yeah, Johanna.
Johanna. What you're describing is, I would argue, exactly what Dr. Perkins is describing, which is this idea of understandings of wide scope. That when, if she's writing a book about lobsters, she has to broaden much more than the idea of a lobster, crustacean. And you have to get into all these other spaces. And by the way, I would recommend 2 books for your daughter. I think she's probably at the right level. One's called Children of Time, and another is called Children of Ruin. And the Children of Ruin is about, this is sci-fi nonfiction. Fiction. And it's talking about how, it's marine biology, but in a future context, and it's terrific. So Children of Ruin is the one that you may want to explore with your daughter. Okay, yeah, no problem. So Joanna's example. So John, let me ask you to keep unmuted for a minute or two more. Tell me more about the educational structure that you're in with your daughter.
So we are currently, so we just moved cross country and moved into a brand new school district. And we did the distance learning stuff, which was just very, very minimal in the spring. And so we just started to kind of put together that shadow curriculum and really start supplementing with our kids. And so all of them started spending time side by side with my husband and I while we were working, and we could kind of assist them one-on-one.
Yeah. Okay, so you sounds like quite a bit of time flexibility and in your work life, right?
We did. We won't going into the fall.
Oh, okay. Well, sorry about that. And then, but you kind of backed into this home learning by first starting with the online learning, distance education, and then beginning to build out the shadow school on your own as you felt more and more comfortable, right? Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Now we're kind of trying to figure out how we make this work for the fall.
Yeah. Well, so thank you for that. And that's a great kind of model for every parent. Again, when people think about education, they tend to think about, when I talk about homeschooling, I should say, or home learning, they think about, I got to either be in full-time school or I've got to be homeschooling or home learning full-time. No, there's 100 different iterations between there. And my suspicion is Johanna is going to continue supplementing, heavy supplementation of work throughout the school year. And that actually leads to the best outcomes because you create the shadow school that then supplements what your current school is unable to provide. Excellent. Thank you for that comment. All right. I saw a question on the chat box that I really felt like needed to be answered. Let me see if I can find it here. Okay, yes. Question was actually Joanna. How does the power differential I talked about earlier work in the high school setting when a GPA and class rank are important? So here's the question that everybody should find an admissions officer at a university or a retired admissions officer and and pepper them with questions. Now, I have a couple friends that do that for me, and here's what they will tell you. If let's use Joanna's example and her daughter. Let's say that she really that she wrote a book on lobsters that tied in all sorts of concepts. That is what is called a piece of the child's portfolio. It is a demonstration of that child's ability to do work, not because it's assigned, but because they have an interest in it. And you build out enough portfolio, you now can bring that to a university and say, listen, here is who I am. Here, and here's demonstrations of who I am. Now I want you, university, to evaluate that. And most admissions officers, if they see a kid with a portfolio that genuinely signals interest, passion, curiosity, a different way of thinking, they are far more interested in that kid than you might think. So yes, GPA matters, unfortunately. Yes, SAT matters, unfortunately, but I would be willing to bet you. In fact, we're making this calculation with our kids right now, that the portfolio is actually going to trump the SAT and GPA. And again, I've gotten feedback that is actually the case. It's a risk, but it's something that I think you can manage the risk if you're playing both ends of this game that I call the education game, doing what you kind of think needs to be done, but also doing what you think should be done at the same time. All right. Whew. I hope this is helpful. Let me continue because some of these questions are overlapping a little bit. So question number 4 from Brenda asked about what textbooks, et cetera, for home learning would be needed. And I said, my answer to that, oh, by the way, Brenda's a grandparent of 3 kids, between the ages of 3 and 13. The curriculum really depends on the finances, the time freedom, and again, we heard Johanna had a lot of time freedom, and so she could create much more opportunity because she had the space, the age of your child, and also your goals. And so for a grandparent, what I tend to say is that homeschooling, really for everything, homeschooling is not about the curriculum. It's not about finding that perfect curriculum or the perfect internet site that my child can learn. It's all about consistency in direction. So I would 9 times out of 10 choose a parent or a family that's going to read a book every day at dinner time together over the parent or the family that has found the perfect online reading program that is occasionally used. It is about the habits of the home, eliminating the trivial, and then this idea that I'm going to keep harping on: less but better, less but better. Most schools will tell you or will signal to you that more is always better. You do more homework, better. You have more classes, better. More challenge, better. No, that's the old way of thinking. It does not apply anymore. So and then for grandparents who are kind of typically kind of supportive of the educational direction of the child, here's what I would recommend: reading, reading, reading. Every time your child or grandchildren come into your home, there's some book that y'all are going to read together. Out loud, a book on tape, or some combination of both. There is nothing that is going to be more valuable to your child than that. And then this other piece, which is, again, this is the idea of less but better. Here are 2 books, and they're really journals that have questions for grandparents, parents, mother, father, grandmother, etc. And the child will sit with the grandparent and complete these questions about the grandparents' childhood, what they learned in their 20s and 30s, what they regretted, what their best day was, things like that. Now, I promise you, if a child spent their time doing this with their grandparent, that is going to be a far more valuable use of their time than any math subject, any history, because frankly, they're going to be learning history through their eyes of their grandparents. And that is going to be material that is going to shape character. Hearing the grandparents tell their stories is going to shape the character of your child. So for a recommendation for a grandparent, this type of content, these idea of questions from my father or stories from grandpa or grandma, that is going to be far more valuable than anything else you could probably be doing with your child. That's my recommendation. All right, last question that I'm going to get to today, I think. This is from Kelly. Online program. What online program do you recommend? Yes. And is there a better program than Prodigy for math? And then thanks for all you do. You're welcome, Kelly. So online education is still in its infancy. And as a result, you get a lot of variety and a lot of stuff that just is kind of garbage. Not suggesting that that Prodigy is garbage, but it is heavily what I call edutainment. The idea that I'm going to trick your child into learning by making something fun for them to do. I actually used a Prodigy just briefly as one of, I've looked at hundreds, dozens of online curriculum. Prodigy is on the edutainment side, is far more edutainment, meaning there's a whole bunch of games involved and a little bit of learning sprinkled in. That's, I guess, okay because the child is learning. For me and for our philosophy is that we avoid gamification of learning. We think that the extrinsic reward is actually not good. We want the child to love learning because it is something that they enjoy, not because their avatar is going to, get a new shield or be able to fight the new monster, which is how Prodigy operates. I've also seen that 9 times out of 10, the kids will eventually get bored with a game, a learning game. a learning game cannot compete with Halo or some of these, Xbox types of games. They're just not competitive. And so I would argue you shouldn't even try. And then lastly, it's not aligned with adult life. There's nowhere in my adult life where someone has said, hey, Matt, we need you to do this work, and here's a game in order for you to get the work done. This never happened. So I'm wishing that it would one day, but it just hasn't. Now, again, the other part about this is that online learning ideally adjusts to the level of the child, and that's part of the beauty of it. There's a cost involved oftentimes. Prodigy is free. The ones I typically recommend are not, but they're not expensive either. And then the most important part of this is that students have to read in order to do the work. So emphasis on reading first, and then math will come later. And so here's what I tend to recommend. It's a program called alex.com. There's actually two. The first is alex.com. And you can tell by just looking at this image, it's not about games. Yes, they have some games that are embedded in it, but it's very light. It's really about here's the content that you're going to be learning about today, and you have to be able to read because there's word problems and questions, et cetera, that are part of that. And then the last math problem or math system that I recommend is one that is called the Art of Problem Solving. It's their junior curriculum is called Beast Academy, and it is extraordinarily tough. There's some games associated with, but generally Art of Problem Solving is one of the most academically challenging math programs that I've seen, and it teaches math not by rote, but it teaches math by saying, here's a problem, figure out how to solve it. And one of my kids, the great story is that she spent 45 minutes on one problem, finally got it right, and then I heard her screaming yes from her bedroom because she finally got this problem right that she'd been working on over and over again for 45 minutes. There is the question I think that Cindy brought up around the character that comes from doing hard things in your academics. And I believe that is important, that doing hard things is part of life and part of growing up. And so Art of Problem Solving is one of those places that it's a challenging deal. It is not cheap, but I would argue you get what you pay for. All right, and then lastly, on the reading side, readingatozd.com is the one that I recommend. It is not cheap in terms, 115, depending on, there's different packages you can buy and different assortment of combinations, but somewhere in between $150 to $300 a year. It has incredible metrics for a parent to monitor the child's use. It's got a great system for early readers, phonics-based early readers. It is top. And the parent's job is really to make sure the child does the work. They don't usually have to sit over the side of the shoulder of the child to make sure the child is doing it. So it also can free up a parent to do more of their own work when child is reading using the system. ABC Mouse is another one. Less thrilled about that one, but the price point is a little bit better. But those are a couple, and then there's there's dozens and dozens of them out there. But readingatozd.com is the one I typically recommend. But more than anything, just setting up the daily habit of reading. This can be a completely free experience. Libraries, if and when they open up, are the best resource in the world. To the degree you can get a book and read it and make sure your children are reading and schedule time every day where reading is part of your family's culture, that is actually far more valuable than many online systems we can use. And then again, the idea of at every moment, the child's in the car, put a book on tape rather than having them play a video game. Dinner time, put a book on tape. One of the callers from a couple weeks ago talked about how they will listen to a story during dinner time using Audible or one of these online book on tape series, and then they will read it outside of dinner as well on their own. So again, all sorts of opportunities to push reading into child's learning. Kathleen, I'm going to have to answer your question another time. Yep. Yeah, I think. Well, let me end with this, and then I'm going to ask you all to fill out a quick survey, and then we'll talk about next steps briefly. So, this question was about assuring, how do you make sure you have a holistic learning approach for your child? And so on the right here is a definition I just pulled off of Wikipedia. The idea of a holistic education, that it is intellectual, it's emotional, it's social, it's physical, it's artistic, it's creative, and it's spiritual. All those are a part of a child's learning, ideally. Now, parents, you must not look at your child's school and say, that is your job. They can't do it. It's not designed for a school. So here's how I approach this in our family, and how part of when I sit down one-on-one with a parent, some of the assessment that I'll do with them. I'm not sure if you can make this out, but let me expand this here so you can see it a little bit better. You're welcome to take a screenshot of it or just send me a note and I can send you a copy of this. But this is essentially it's a scorecard on how our kids are doing in these different areas, and it's self-reported. On the right, you'll see these relationships. And so, what are the 6 or 7 relationships that are most important to you, and how are they doing, and how are they growing over time or declining? You see places like learning and your purpose. If you found your purpose and are pursuing it. Finances, again, to me, this huge blind spot in education is that kids aren't taught about personal finance. Again, that's going to need to fall to the parent. But when you complete this assessment with your kids, they start to see, hey, you know what? Physically, I'm actually not doing so great here, or my relationships are really kind of weak. And then you can coach them around how do you build that up. But my hope is that my kids could complete this assessment and have all of them, on the high side, on the full side in terms of their assessment. That to me would be a beautiful place for my kids to be. And so that's kind of, and you can add more things to this, change it, of course, if you'd like. And I just noticed that, learning is in there, but sometimes break out math and reading as two separate parts of learning. But this is a way to assess your child in a holistic way. And again, as a parent, that's part of your job, to make sure I'm paying attention to not just my child's academics, but also their emotional state, their physical, health, etc. So I hope that's helpful. Send me a note if that is. Okay. Lots of chats, and sorry I'm not able to follow those, but you guys are helping one another out, which is great. Excellent. So someone asked me to share my slides. I'll be happy to do that. Look for that later today. Question from Rayanne about outsourcing to supplement. What are your thoughts on outschool to supplement and also build interests of kids? I don't know that. What outschool is, so that's something we'll need to talk through. Okay, all right, let me go ahead and start to close this up. So listen, I hope this was helpful. Here are the next moves. First off, I would ask you to sign up for my blog. I'm going to be pushing information out on the blog regularly, and again, a lot of that's going to be somewhat timely based on whatever's going on. I'm sure as we get closer to August, there's going to be a lot of chatter around how schools are going to be structured, and I'm already making some content and talking through that. And then, I've been offering these one-on-one sessions. I've gotten burned by a few folks who scheduled it and then, didn't show up. And so I'm being advised by some that I should charge to get people to actually show up. I don't know if that's the right deal, but I'm going to try it. And so this next week will be the last time that I'll offer the free. So I hope you guys can schedule a one-on-one with me. After that point, it will be some cost, not much. I don't want to put a barrier for families to have conversations about their kids. But in those conversations, we will talk about your specific situation, whether you're a teacher, grandparent, or parent, and what your questions are, and we can go into some detail that we can't do on a conference call like this. So I hope this was helpful. Here's the last thing. This is the survey that I'm going to ask you to complete, please. Exit survey. It should show up on your screen. If you have a phone, it may not show up. But for all others, I just ask you to do it. Just take 2 minutes or so to complete. here, I always show this to the participants because I want you all to know if you felt it was helpful, then great, and if it wasn't, then I want to make some adjustments. So I feel more equipped to lead my child's education. Somewhat yes, somewhat strongly so, great. I will recommend future webinars to friends. Strongly agree, great. Today's session was a good use of my time, excellent. And then I will schedule a one-on-one session with Matt, terrific. Go to my website, theeducationgame.com/contacts, and you'll see a button for a free 45-minute one-on-one. Looking forward to having those conversations with y'all. Again, I hope this was helpful, and I will be praying for the success of you and your children. I'm doing this work because it is my passion, it is my why, and I'm hopeful that's helpful to you. Thanks a lot, and I'll catch you on the next conversation. Take care.